They found a gorilla and a woman with no clothes in the zoo. What happened inside there was shocking. Jeff Morgan hated the graveyard shift at Lincoln City Zoo. The pay was decent enough, but walking around in the dark with nothing but sleeping animals and his flashlight for company gave him the creeps. Usually, nothing interesting happened, just the occasional raccoon trying to steal food from the trash cans or teenagers attempting to sneak it on a dare. That Thursday morning started like any other. The sun hadn't come up yet, and a light drizzle made everything look hazy under the security lights. Jeff was doing his regular rounds, checking the locks on the enclosures and making sure everything was in order. He'd already covered most of the zoo and was heading toward his favorite part, the primate section. The gorillas always seemed peaceful at night, unlike some other animals that got restless after dark. As he approached the massive gorilla enclosure, something felt off. The air felt different somehow, charged with an energy he couldn't explain. He heard rustling coming from inside, which wasn't unusual. The gorillas sometimes moved around at night. But this sound was different. It wasn't the heavy movement he was used to hearing. Jeff raised his flashlight, its beam cutting through the early morning darkness. At first, he saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the familiar shapes of trees, rocks, and the artificial habitat that made up the gorilla's home. Then, he caught a glimpse of something pale moving near the back of the enclosure. "Hello," he called out, his voice shaky. "Is someone there?" The movement stopped. Jeff's heart began racing as he moved closer to the reinforced glass barrier. He swept his flashlight beam across the enclosure again, more slowly this time. That's when he saw her, a woman, crouched low to the ground, wearing what looked like torn clothes. She was huddled against the back wall, her eyes reflecting the flashlight beam like a startled animal's. Jeff fumbled for his radio, nearly dropping it in his panic. "Control, this is Jeff at the gorilla enclosure. We have an emergency situation. There's a woman inside the enclosure. I repeat, there's a woman inside the gorilla enclosure." The radio crackled with static before a voice responded. "Copy that. Stay where you are. Security team en route." Jeff couldn't take his eyes off the woman. She hadn't moved since he spotted her, staying perfectly still in her crouched position. The weirdest part was that she didn't look scared. If anything, she seemed comfortable. The thought made his skin crawl. Within minutes, he heard the sound of running footsteps approaching. 3 security guards arrived, followed closely by Sarah Chen, the night supervisor. They all clustered around the glass, their flashlights joining Jeff's to illuminate the bizarre scene. "Has she moved at all?" Sarah asked, already dialing numbers on her phone. "No," Jeff replied, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. "She's just staying there." Sarah spoke rapidly into her phone, calling the police and then the zoo's veterinary team. The woman remained motionless, her eyes now closed, seemingly oblivious to the growing crowd of people watching her. "Where's Kong?" one of the security guards asked suddenly, referring to the enclosure's resident male gorilla. Everyone's flashlights began scanning the enclosure frantically. The massive silverback was nowhere to be seen in the main area. Jeff felt his stomach drop when he realized the gorilla must be in one of the indoor sleeping areas, which meant it could emerge at any moment. The next 15 minutes felt like hours. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as they approached the zoo. Sarah had already called Dr. Martinez, the head veterinarian, who arrived looking disheveled but alert, carrying a tranquilizer rifle just in case. "We need to get her out before Kong wakes up," Dr. Martinez said, checking the rifle scope. "Once he comes out and sees her, things could get complicated real fast." The woman still hadn't moved much, except to occasionally shift her weight from one foot to the other. Her behavior was unlike anything Jeff had seen in his 3 years working security. Most people who ended up where they shouldn't be, usually drunk college students or thrill seekers, would be panicking by now, screaming for help. But she remained eerily calm. The police arrived in force, their red and blue lights casting strange shadows through the trees in the enclosure. 2 officers immediately started questioning Jeff about what he'd seen, while others consulted with Sarah about the best way to get the woman out safely. "The service entrance," Sarah suggested, pointing to a heavy metal door on the side of the enclosure. "We can send in a rescue team dash." She was cut off by a low, rumbling sound that made everyone freeze. Calm had emerged from his sleeping area, his massive dark shape visible in the growing morning light. The gorilla moved with surprising grace for his size, heading straight for the water source near where the woman was crouched. "Nobody make any sudden moves," Dr. Martinez whispered, though Calm couldn't have heard them through the thick glass. "If he gets agitated." But something extraordinary happened. As Calm approached the woman, she didn't run or scream. Instead, she lowered her head slightly and remained perfectly still. The massive gorilla paused a few feet away from her, nostrils flaring as he took in her scent. The gathered crowd watched in stunned silence as Calm simply sat down near the woman, showing no signs of aggression. If anything, he seemed curious about this strange visitor in his territory. "This isn't normal," Dr. Martinez muttered, lowering his rifle slightly. "Gorillas don't typically." He trailed off as more zoo staff arrived, including several members of the primate care team. They huddled together, speaking in hushed voices and occasionally pointing at the woman and Calm. The sky was getting lighter now, the first real rays of sunlight beginning to pierce through the morning mist. Jeff could see the woman more clearly. She appeared to be in her 30s, with dark hair matted against her head from the drizzle. Her clothes, what remained of them, looked expensive despite their torn state. News crews had begun arriving, setting up their cameras at a respectful distance, but clearly eager to capture this bizarre scene. Police officers were trying to keep them back, while simultaneously coordinating with zoo staff about how to handle the situation. "We need to clear the area," Sarah announced suddenly. "Too many people might agitate Calm. Essential personnel only." As the crowd began to thin out, Jeff found himself being questioned again, this time by a detective who had just arrived. He repeated everything he had seen, though it felt surreal even as he said it out loud. "And you're sure you didn't see how she got in?" the detective asked, scribbling in his notebook. "No, sir," Jeff replied, shaking his head. "The enclosure was secure during my previous round, about an hour before I found her. All cameras and alarms were working normally." The mystery of how she had managed to get inside without triggering any alarms only added to the strangeness of the situation. The enclosure walls were over 20 feet high, topped with electric fencing, and the service doors required key card access that would have been logged in the security system. As the sun continued to rise, casting long shadows across the zoo grounds, more questions than answers hung in the morning air. Nobody could explain how she got there, why she was there, or most puzzling of all, why one of the zoo's most powerful residents seemed completely at ease with her presence. By noon, the story had exploded. Social media was buzzing with blurry photos taken by early morning joggers who'd passed by the zoo, and local news stations had interrupted their regular programming to cover what they were calling the Gorilla Girl incident. Outside the zoo's main entrance, a crowd had gathered despite the continued drizzle. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching into the gray sky like metal trees. Reporters stood in front of cameras, their umbrellas bobbing as they delivered updates to their viewers, even though there wasn't much new to report. "I heard she jumped in on purpose," a teenage boy told anyone who would listen, his phone held high as he live-streamed the scene. "My cousin works at the coffee shop across the street, and he said she scaled the wall like Spider-Man." An older woman in a raincoat shook her head. "That's nonsense. Obviously, she was sleepwalking. My neighbor's daughter does that sometimes. Walks right out of the house in her pajamas." The theories got wilder as the day wore on. Some people swore they'd seen her at the zoo the day before, acting suspiciously. Others claimed she must have been living in the enclosure for days, hiding in the artificial caves during the day. Inside the zoo's administrative building, Sarah Chin was dealing with a flood of phone calls. News outlets from across the country wanted statements, and social media managers were bombarding the zoo's accounts with interview requests. "No, we cannot confirm if she's a former employee," Sarah repeated for what felt like the 100th time. "We're cooperating fully with the police investigation, and that's all I can say right now." She hung up and rubbed her temples, looking at the growing stack of messages on her desk. The zoo's PR team had arrived in force, setting up a makeshift command center in the conference room next door. Through the thin walls, Sarah could hear them arguing about how to handle the situation. "We need to get ahead of this story," one voice insisted. "People are saying we have lax security." "But we can't say anything until we know who she is," another responded. "What if she's connected to someone important?" The speculation wasn't limited to the public and media. Even the zoo staff, who should have known better, couldn't help but theorize about the mysterious woman. In the employee break room, a group of zookeepers huddled around a small TV showing the local news coverage. "Look at how she was with Kong," Maria from the bird sanctuary said, pointing at the grainy footage someone had captured of the woman and the gorilla sitting near each other. "That's not normal. She must have some experience with primates." Tom, one of the veteran elephant keepers, snorted. "Or she's just crazy lucky. Remember that guy in San Diego who jumped into the panda exhibit? Sometimes stupid people get lucky." "This is different," Maria insisted. "Did you see how she was positioned? That's submissive posturing. She knows what she's doing." The break room door opened, and Dr. Martinez stepped in, looking exhausted. Everyone immediately bombarded him with questions, but he held up his hands. "I can't discuss the situation," he said firmly. "But I will say this. In 20 years of veterinary medicine, I've never seen anything quite like it." That statement only fueled more speculation. By early afternoon, conspiracy theories had started sprouting up online. Some people claimed she was part of a secret government experiment in human-animal communication. Others suggested she was making some kind of political statement about animal captivity. Local businesses were cashing in on the sensation. The coffee shop across from the zoo had already created a Gorilla Girl Latte, a banana-flavored drink with chocolate sprinkles. A street vendor was selling hastily printed t-shirts with "I survived the Gorilla Girl mystery" written across the front. The police weren't having any luck quieting the rumors. Detective Mike Reynolds stood in front of the growing crowd, trying to give a statement that would calm the speculation without revealing too much about the ongoing investigation. "We are aware of the situation and are working closely with zoo officials," he said, his voice barely carrying over the murmur of the crowd. "We ask the public to refrain from spreading unconfirmed information." But in the age of social media, containing information was like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Someone had started a Reddit thread collecting all the different theories, and it was growing by the minute. Amateur sleuths were combing through years of zoo-related news, looking for any connection to mysterious women or gorilla-related incidents. The local animal rights groups had shown up too, carrying hastily made signs protesting the zoo's security measures. They clustered near the main entrance, chanting about animal welfare and demanding answers. "What else don't we know about what goes on here?" their leader shouted through a megaphone. "What are they hiding?" The zoo's gift shop, which remained open despite the chaos, was doing record business. Tourists who had come for a normal day at the zoo found themselves in the middle of a media circus, and they were loving it. Gorilla plush toys were flying off the shelves, and someone had started a rumor that the shop would be selling commemorative Gorilla Girl merchandise soon. Inside the administrative building, the police had set up a temporary command post. They were reviewing security footage from the previous night, trying to piece together how the woman had gotten into the enclosure without triggering any alarms. "Look at this," one officer said, pointing at his laptop screen. "There's a 3-minute gap in the footage around 4 a.m. "Equipment malfunction?" his partner suggested. "In just one camera? Covering just that area? Seems convenient." The gap in the security footage sparked a new round of theories. Some people started suggesting it was an inside job, that someone at the zoo must have helped her get in. Others wondered if she had professional help, pointing out that disabling security cameras required technical knowledge. By late afternoon, national news networks had picked up the story. Satellite trucks from CNN and Fox News had joined the local stations, and reporters were doing live updates every hour. Expert commentators were being brought in to analyze every aspect of the situation. "The gorilla's behavior is particularly interesting," a primatologist said during one broadcast. "Silverbacks are typically very territorial, especially with strangers in their space. The fact that this one remained calm suggests either incredibly good fortune or some level of familiarity." Social media influencers had started arriving too, hoping to capitalize on the story. They stood in front of the zoo entrance, recording videos for their followers, and adding their own theories to the mix. What if she's actually a shapeshifter? One popular TikToker suggested to his millions of followers. Think about it. Why else would the gorilla be so chill with her? The zoo's phone lines were completely overwhelmed. Besides media inquiries, they were getting calls from people claiming to know the woman's identity, each story more outlandish than the last. Some said she was a former circus performer. Others insisted she was a famous wildlife photographer known for getting dangerous close-ups. As evening approached, the crowd outside the zoo showed no signs of dispersing. If anything, it had grown larger as people got off work and came to see what all the fuss was about. Food trucks had started parking nearby, turning the scene into something between a protest and a festival. The mystery woman had become an instant urban legend, her story growing and changing with each retelling. But the truth, when it finally emerged, would prove stranger than any of the theories circulating in the crowd. Detective Reynolds sat at his desk, staring at the file that had just landed in his inbox. After hours of searching databases and following leads, they had finally identified the woman from the gorilla enclosure. Her name was Claire Bennett, and she wasn't just any random person. She had worked at Lincoln City Zoo for 3 years, ending just 8 months ago. "Well, this changes things," he muttered, scrolling through her employment history. Claire had been a senior primate specialist, specifically working with the gorillas. Her personnel file showed nothing but glowing reviews until her sudden resignation last summer. No explanation was given. She had simply turned in her badge one day and never came back. The detective picked up his phone and dialed Sarah Chin. "We need to talk about Claire Bennett." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You found out. Why didn't you tell us she was a former employee?" "Because it's complicated," Sarah replied, her voice tired. "And because I was hoping I was wrong about who it was." 20 minutes later, they sat in Sarah's office, surrounded by old personnel files and incident reports. The picture they painted was fascinating. Claire hadn't just been good at her job, she had been exceptional. She had a way with the gorillas that other keepers couldn't match, especially with Kong. Kong was always difficult, Sarah explained, pulling out a photo of Claire standing near the massive silverback. He'd been transferred here from another zoo because of behavioral issues. Claire was the only one who could really handle him. The photo showed Claire much different than how they'd found her that morning, professional, confident, wearing the zoo's khaki uniform. She was smiling at the camera while Kong sat nearby, looking surprisingly relaxed. "So, what happened?" Reynolds asked, noting the date on the photo, just 2 weeks before her resignation. Sarah pulled out another file, this one marked with a red tab. There was an incident. Nothing major, no one got hurt. But it scared people. According to the report, Claire had been found inside the gorilla enclosure after hours. She claimed she'd seen Kong showing signs of distress and had entered to check on him. The security system had been disabled, just like this morning. "We couldn't prove she turned it off," Sarah continued, "but who else would have known how? She'd been here long enough to know all our protocols." Reynolds leaned back in his chair, processing this information. Was she fired? No, we were going to put her on probation, maybe transfer her to another department. But she quit before we could even discuss it. Left a resignation letter on my desk and disappeared. The detective started making notes. "Did anyone check on her? See where she went?" Sarah nodded, pulling out more papers. "We tried. Her apartment was emptied out. Phone disconnected. Some of the staff heard she'd moved to California to work at a sanctuary, but we never confirmed it." The investigation had taken on a new dimension. This wasn't just about a random person in a dangerous situation. This was about someone who knew exactly what they were doing, who had done something similar before. Reynolds spread the documents across the desk, creating a timeline. Claire had started at the zoo fresh out of graduate school, where she'd studied primate behavior. Her thesis had been about communication methods between humans and great apes. She'd published several papers during her time at the zoo, all focused on gorilla behavior and cognition. "There's something else," Sarah said, hesitating before pulling out a personal notebook. Claire had theories about gorilla communication that some people thought were unusual. The notebook was filled with Claire's handwriting, pages of observations, sketches, and notes about gorilla behavior. But it went beyond standard scientific observation. Claire had documented what she believed were complex communication patterns, suggesting that gorillas had a much more sophisticated language than previously thought. "Look at these entries," Sarah said, pointing to a section dated about a month before the first incident. She started claiming she could understand Kong's vocalizations, not just in a general sense, but actual specific meanings. Reynolds skimmed the pages. Claire's notes had become increasingly detailed and passionate, describing what she believed were breakthrough moments in interspecies communication. She wrote about spending hours observing Kong, learning his habits, his moods, his ways of expressing himself. "Did anyone else support these theories?" Reynolds asked. Sarah shook her head. Most of the staff thought she was getting too attached, losing her scientific objectivity. "We had some concerns about her mental health, especially after she started coming in during off hours." The detective found an entry from the night before her resignation. The handwriting was rushed, excited. "Kong tried to tell me something today. I know how it sounds, but I'm certain. The others don't understand. They're not listening properly. He's more intelligent than anyone realizes. I have to find a way to prove it." The next day, she was gone. Reynolds pulled out his phone and started making calls. Within an hour, he had tracked down several of Claire's former colleagues. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle. "Claire was brilliant," said Dr. James Wilson, a former research partner. "But she started going down this rabbit hole about advanced gorilla intelligence. Became obsessed with the idea that we were missing something crucial about how they communicate." Another keeper, Maria Torres, remembered Claire's last few weeks differently. She wasn't crazy. She was onto something. Kong's behavior changed when she was around. He was calmer, more engaged. "I've worked with gorillas for 15 years, and I'd never seen anything like it." As the detective dug deeper, he found more unusual details. Claire had spent her own money installing additional cameras in the gorilla enclosure, claiming she needed to document Kong's nighttime behavior. She had filled dozens of notebooks with observations, developed her own system for categorizing gorilla vocalizations. "Here's what I don't understand," Reynolds said to Sarah, after hours of reviewing the files. "If she was so dedicated to this research, why did she just abandon it?" Sarah reached into her desk and pulled out one final document, an email Claire had sent to her personal account the night she resigned. She had never shared it with anyone else. "I can't keep doing this their way," Claire had written. "They think I'm seeing things that aren't there, but they're wrong. Kong is trying to communicate something important. If I stay here, bound by all these rules and restrictions, I'll never figure it out. I have to find another way." Reynolds read the email twice, then looked at the security footage from that morning. The woman crouched in the enclosure, Kong sitting calmly nearby. "She came back for a reason." "The question is," Sarah replied, "what was so important that she had to break in to do it?" As they sat there surrounded by the pieces of Claire's past, the mystery had only grown deeper. This wasn't just about a woman in a gorilla enclosure anymore. It was about a brilliant scientist who had either discovered something revolutionary or lost herself in an impossible theory. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows through Sarah's office window. Somewhere in the zoo, Kong was settling in for the night, possibly holding secrets that only Claire Bennett understood, or thought she understood. The detective gathered his notes, his mind already working on next steps. One thing was clear: finding Claire's current location was only the beginning. The real mystery was what had brought her back, what she believed she had discovered, and whether she was brilliant, desperate, or both. The next morning, Lincoln City Zoo found itself under an uncomfortable spotlight. News of Claire Bennett's identity and her history with the zoo had leaked, turning what was already a sensational story into something far more complex. The morning shows were having a field day with headlines like "Gone Girl, Gone Gorilla" and "Primate Whisper Returns." Inside the zoo's administrative building, an emergency board meeting was underway. The room was tense, with board members sitting stiffly in their chairs while Sarah Chun and Dr. Martinez presented what they knew. "So you're telling me," Board Chairman Richard Wallace interrupted, his face red with anger, that not only did this woman work here, but she had a previous incident that was never reported to the board? Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. We handled it internally at the time. She resigned before any formal action was taken. And now she's back, somehow getting past our security systems twice. Wallace's voice rose with each word. Do you have any idea how this looks? The other board members murmured in agreement. Someone mentioned potential lawsuits, while another worried about their insurance coverage. The zoo's reputation, carefully built over decades, was at risk. Outside the boardroom, the zoo staff was divided. Many remembered Claire fondly and couldn't reconcile their memories of her with the current situation. Others felt betrayed, wondering if she had been planning something like this all along. I always thought there was something off about how she left, Tom from Elephant Care said during lunch break. You don't just walk away from a career like that without a reason. Maria Torres defended her former colleague fiercely. You didn't work with her directly. Claire wasn't crazy. She was passionate. There's a difference. The police investigation had taken an unexpected turn as well. Detective Reynolds sat in his office, staring at a series of emails recovered from Claire's old work account. They were exchanges between her and various research institutions, dating from just before her resignation. Look at this, he said to his partner, pointing at one particular message. 3 weeks before she quit, she tried to get funding for a study on advanced guerrilla communication. Every single institution turned her down. Emails grew increasingly desperate as rejection after rejection came in. Claire's normally professional tone had given way to emotional pleas, trying to convince anyone, to take her research seriously. But it was what happened after her resignation that really caught Reynolds' attention. In the months following her departure, several research papers had been published questioning traditional understanding of guerrilla intelligence. None mentioned Claire directly, but their findings aligned suspiciously well with her theories. They stole her work, Maria insisted when Reynolds interviewed her again. Claire tried to do things the right way, through proper channels. When that didn't work, she got pushed into a corner. The detective wasn't so sure. Pushed into breaking into a guerrilla enclosure? Maria's face hardened. You don't understand. She had evidence of something important, something that could change how we see these animals. But nobody would listen. As Reynolds dug deeper, more suspicious details emerged. The security camera malfunction during Claire's break-in wasn't an isolated incident. There had been similar glitches during her time as an employee, always around the guerrilla enclosure, always during off hours. She knew our systems inside and out, Sarah admitted when confronted with this information. Part of her job was coordinating with security for nighttime observations. She helped design some of our protocols. The zoo's IT department made an even more disturbing discovery. Someone had been accessing their network remotely, looking at security schedules and camera feeds. The intrusions were sophisticated, hiding behind multiple proxies, but they'd been happening for months. We can't prove it was her, the IT manager said, but whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for. The situation grew more complicated when an anonymous email arrived at several news outlets. It contained fragments of Claire's research notes, along with claims that the zoo had deliberately suppressed her findings. Social media exploded with conspiracy theories and accusations. What if she's being silenced? One viral tweet suggested. What if she discovered something they don't want us to know? The zoo's PR team was overwhelmed trying to manage the crisis. Every statement they released seemed to raise more questions than it answered. Why hadn't they mentioned her connection to the zoo immediately? What were they trying to hide? Even Kong's behavior became subject to scrutiny. Video clips from Claire's time at the zoo surfaced, showing the gorilla responding to her in ways that did seem unusual. Animal behavior experts debated on news programs, some dismissing it as standard conditioning, others admitting there might be something worth investigating. The way he positions himself when she's present, one expert noted, it's almost like they're having a conversation. The zoo board called in external consultants to review everything: security systems, personnel files, research protocols. They discovered that during Claire's employment, she had spent an unprecedented amount of time with Kong, far more than standard procedures recommended. Look at these logs, Wallace said during another emergency meeting. Late-night observations, extended interaction sessions, unauthorized protocol modifications. How did we miss this? Sarah tried to explain. Claire's results were exceptional. Kong's behavioral issues improved dramatically under her care. We thought. You thought what? Wallace interrupted. That it was okay to let her run wild because she got results? And now we have a PR nightmare on our hands. The police weren't having much luck either. Claire had covered her tracks well. Her current address led to an empty apartment in California. Her phone was a prepaid burner. Her bank accounts showed no activity for months. But she had to be somewhere. People don't just vanish, especially not people with advanced degrees and professional careers. Reynolds found himself returning to her notes, reading them with new eyes. She writes about patterns, he told his partner. Not just in Kong's behavior, but in everything: security rotations, staff movements, even the timing of the zoo's maintenance schedules. The implication was clear. Claire hadn't just stumbled back into the zoo by chance. This had been planned, possibly for months. Every detail, from the security camera disruption to the timing of her entry, showed careful preparation. But for what purpose? As the day wore on, tension at the zoo reached a breaking point. Someone leaked that Claire had tried to publish her research findings before her resignation, and that the zoo's research review board had blocked it. It wasn't approved because it didn't meet scientific standards, Dr. Martinez explained wearily to yet another reporter. We couldn't verify her conclusions. But others remembered differently. She had data, Maria insisted to anyone who would listen. Hours of recordings, behavioral logs, documented patterns. They wouldn't even look at it. The mystery had evolved from a simple security breach into something far more complex. Was Claire Bennett a disgruntled ex-employee seeking revenge? A misunderstood researcher trying to prove her theories? Or was there something else going on, something that no one had figured out yet? As night fell over the zoo, Kong sat in his enclosure, seemingly unaffected by the chaos surrounding him. Security guards watched him nervously, wondering if Claire would try to return. But the gorilla simply went about his evening routine, occasionally making soft vocalizations that, perhaps, held messages only Claire could understand. The truth was still out there, hidden somewhere in the intersection of scientific ambition, institutional bureaucracy, and one woman's absolute conviction that she had discovered something extraordinary. The question was, how far would she go to prove it? The truth began to unravel 3 days after Claire's appearance in the gorilla enclosure, and it started with a USB drive. A janitor found it taped under Claire's old desk, which hadn't been used since she left. The small black device might have stayed hidden forever if the desk hadn't been marked for replacement during the zoo's ongoing security overhaul. Detective Reynolds sat in the zoo's computer lab, watching as IT specialists carefully accessed the drive's contents. The files were encrypted, but Claire had left a text document with the password, Kong Knows 2023. What they found made everyone in the room fall silent. Hours of video footage filled the screen, all showing Kong in his enclosure at night. But it wasn't just random recordings. Each clip was carefully annotated, tagged with timestamps and behavioral notes. The gorilla wasn't just moving around randomly. He was making specific gestures, repeated patterns of movement that corresponded with certain events. Look at this one, the IT specialist said, pointing to a clip from 6 months before Claire's resignation. Kong was making a particular motion with his hands, then looking toward the water source in his enclosure. The same clip showed maintenance logs. The water system had failed the next day. Clip after clip showed the same thing. Kong displaying specific behaviors that preceded events, equipment malfunctions, weather changes, even the arrival of new animals. Claire had documented everything, creating a database of what she called predictive behaviors. Dr. Martinez was called in to review the footage. His initial skepticism faded as he watched. "This is unprecedented," he muttered, taking notes frantically. The correlation between his gestures and subsequent events is far too consistent to be coincidental. But the real breakthrough came when they found Claire's research journal, hidden in the encrypted files. It wasn't just about Kong predicting events, it was about why he was doing it. "The traditional model of gorilla intelligence is fundamentally flawed," Claire had written. "We've been asking the wrong questions. It's not about whether they can understand us, It's about whether we can understand them. Kong isn't just reacting to his environment. He's trying to communicate information about it. The journal detailed how Claire had first noticed the pattern. Kong would make specific movements before maintenance issues occurred, different gestures before weather changes, unique signals before social conflicts among the other gorillas. At first, she thought it was just coincidence, but as she documented more and more instances, a clear pattern emerged. He's not predicting these events, she wrote. He's perceiving them before they happen. The signs are there: changes in air pressure, vibrations in equipment, subtle shifts in group dynamics, and he's trying to warn us. But we've been too busy measuring his intelligence by human standards to notice he's been using his own. Sarah Chen read through the journal, her face growing pale. This explains the first incident, she said quietly. When we found her in the enclosure last summer, she said Kong was showing signs of distress. Reynolds checked the maintenance logs from that date. Sure enough, there had been a major failure in the enclosure's heating system the next day. If it hadn't been caught, it could have put the gorillas at risk. She tried to tell us, Maria Torres said, her voice shaking as she looked through the files. She tried to go through proper channels first. But how do you explain something like this to people who aren't ready to hear it? The implications were staggering. Claire hadn't lost her mind or become obsessed. She had discovered something that challenged everything we thought we knew about gorilla intelligence. But proving it meant breaking protocols, staying late, bending rules. When the zoo's research board dismissed her findings, she faced an impossible choice. The resignation wasn't about giving up, Reynolds realized, reading through her final notes. She was gathering more evidence. The surveillance footage from the morning they found her suddenly made more sense. Kong had been displaying the same behaviors she had documented, specific movements, particular gestures. Claire hadn't broken in randomly. She had seen these warnings through the security cameras she'd been accessing. Dr. Martinez reviewed the footage from that morning again, this time looking for the patterns Claire had documented. There, he said, pointing to Kong's movements. According to her notes, that's his signal for structural instability. A full inspection of the enclosure revealed hairline cracks in one of the support structures. Nothing immediately dangerous, but something that could have become serious if left unchecked. The recent heavy rains had accelerated the wear, but none of the regular inspections had caught it. She didn't break in to prove her research, Sarah said, realization dawning. She broke in to prevent an accident. The zoo's board was stunned. Chairman Wallace sat in his office, reviewing the evidence with a mix of disbelief and regret. The research they had dismissed as unscientific now seemed prescient. The protocols they had accused Claire of breaking had actually prevented potential disasters. The media story transformed overnight. Headlines changed from disgraced researchers break-in to groundbreaking discovery in animal intelligence. Claire's research, finally given the attention it deserved, sparked intense interest from the scientific community. But Claire herself remained elusive. The police found security camera footage of her leaving the zoo that morning, carrying what looked like a hard drive. She had walked calmly to a waiting car and driven away. The vehicle was registered to a renowned primate research center in Seattle. She wasn't running away, Reynolds concluded. She was taking her evidence somewhere it would be properly evaluated. The zoo received a letter from Claire's lawyer the next day. She wasn't pressing charges or seeking publicity. All she wanted was for her research to be taken seriously, for Kong's abilities to be properly studied and documented. I understand why people thought I was crazy, she wrote. It's easier to dismiss something that challenges everything you think you know. But Kong has been trying to tell us something important, that animals perceive and understand their world in ways we never imagined. All we have to do is learn how to listen. The zoo's research protocols were completely overhauled. New equipment was installed to monitor the subtle environmental changes Kong seemed to detect. A team of researchers was assembled to continue Claire's work, this time with full institutional support. And Kong? He continued his daily routines, still making his gentle gestures, still trying to communicate with the humans who were finally learning to understand him. The mystery of the woman in the gorilla enclosure had revealed something far more profound than anyone had expected. a reminder that intelligence comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most important discoveries require us to question everything we think we know. The full story of what happened inside the gorilla enclosure that morning emerged gradually, pieced together from Claire's own account, security footage, and testimony from those present. What had appeared from the outside as a bizarre and dangerous stunt was revealed to be a calculated risk taken by someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Claire had been monitoring the zoo's security feeds for weeks, watching Kong's behavior patterns. When she saw him making the urgent gestures she'd documented as signs of structural instability, she knew she had to act fast. The rain had been unusually heavy that week, and her calculations suggested the support structure's degradation was accelerating. "I tried calling the zoo's emergency line," she explained later in her official statement. "I tried emailing maintenance. I even tried reaching out to former colleagues. But how do you convince someone that a gorilla is warning about structural damage? They'd think you were crazy." The decision to enter the enclosure hadn't been made lightly. Claire knew better than anyone the risks involved. But she also knew Kong, understood his behaviors in a way no one else did. The security footage showed her methodical preparation, removing her rain-soaked outer clothing that might appear threatening or unusual to Kong, approaching from the angle that would be least challenging to a silverback, maintaining the proper submissive posture. "The hardest part wasn't getting in," she admitted. "It was knowing that I had to stay there long enough for someone to find me." Kong's warning signs were clear. The structure wouldn't hold much longer. "I needed officials to take it seriously, and that meant being caught." Dr. Martinez, reviewing the security footage with a team of primate experts, pointed out the incredible precision of her movements. "Look at how she positions herself," he noted, freezing a frame. Every gesture is deliberate, communicating submission and familiarity to Kong. She's using years of research and observation in every movement. The most remarkable part was her interaction with Kong himself. When the massive silverback emerged from his sleeping area, Claire didn't panic. Instead, she employed the communication methods she'd developed during her years of research. Her movements were subtle but specific, a tilt of the head, a shift in posture, hands held in particular positions. She was literally speaking his language, Maria Torres explained to the research team. All those hours of observation, all those patterns she documented, she wasn't just recording them, she was learning them. Kong's response was extraordinary. Instead of displaying aggression, he approached Claire with what experts would later describe as recognition behaviors. He sat near her, occasionally making soft vocalizations that matched patterns in Claire's research notes. The risk she took became clearer when structural engineers examined the support she'd been concerned about. The concrete had been compromised by water seepage, creating a weakness that regular inspections had missed. Under the continued stress of the heavy rains, it could have failed catastrophically. If that section had collapsed, it would have triggered a cascade failure, the chief engineer reported. The entire northern wall of the enclosure could have come down during visiting hours, with crowds nearby. He left the implications unspoken. Claire's understanding of Kong's behavior had quite possibly prevented a tragedy. But the personal risk she'd taken was enormous. One wrong move, one misread signal, and she could have faced a very different outcome. "People think gorillas are just aggressive animals," she explained in her detailed report. "But they're incredibly sophisticated communicators." Kong wasn't just warning about the structural damage. He was trying to protect his family, his territory. "By entering his space the way I did, I was acknowledging his warning and showing I was there to help." The zoo's veterinary team, reviewing Kong's behavior during and after the incident, noted something remarkable. The gorilla's stress indicators had actually decreased while Claire was in the enclosure. He had recognized her not as an intruder, but as someone familiar, someone who understood his attempts to communicate. "It challenges everything we think we know about animal intelligence," Dr. Martinez admitted. "Not just their ability to perceive threats, but their capacity to try to warn us about them. How many other signals have we been missing?" The bravery of Claire's actions became even more apparent when the full scope of her preparation was revealed. She had spent months documenting Kong's warning behaviors, building a database of his communications. She had mapped out every possible entry point to the enclosure, calculated the risks, and chosen the safest approach. She didn't just rush in, Detective Reynolds noted in his final report. Every step was planned, every risk assessed. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she knew it was the only way to prevent a potential disaster. The zoo's security team found their own logs had been affected by Claire's detailed understanding of their protocols. She had timed her entry perfectly between guard rotations, used her knowledge of camera blind spots, and even accounted for the early morning feeding schedule of the gorillas. It wasn't just about getting in, Sarah Chin realized. She needed to be found at exactly the right time, by the right people, so her warning would be taken seriously. The morning shift security guard, Jeff Morgan, had found her at precisely the moment she had planned, when enough staff would be arriving to respond quickly, but before the day's activities would put people at risk from the weakened structure. Claire's actions forced the zoo to reevaluate not just their security protocols, but their entire approach to animal intelligence and communication. Her research, born from years of careful observation and documentation, had revealed something profound about the capabilities of these animals. What she did was incredibly dangerous, Dr. Martinez acknowledged. But she understood the risks better than anyone, and she knew what was at stake. Sometimes the bravest actions are the ones that seem crazy to everyone else. The support structure was repaired, Khan's warning behaviors were validated, and Claire's research was finally given the attention it deserved. But perhaps the most important outcome was a fundamental shift in how the zoo approached animal communication. They began developing new protocols for monitoring and responding to behavioral warnings from all their animals, not just the gorillas. Claire's brave attempt at survival hadn't just saved lives. It had opened up new possibilities for understanding the complex relationships between humans and animals. Her willingness to risk everything to prevent a disaster had transformed a potential tragedy into a breakthrough in animal-human communication. When the full story broke, it sparked a public reaction that nobody had anticipated. What had started as a sensational news story about a woman in a gorilla enclosure transformed into a watershed moment in how people viewed animal intelligence and human-animal relationships. Social media exploded with support for Claire. The hashtag #KongKnows started trending worldwide, with people sharing their own stories of animals showing unexpected intelligence or trying to communicate with humans. The mocking memes and jokes from the first days were replaced by thoughtful discussions about animal cognition and human prejudices. I've been working as my building's maintenance guy for 20 years, one viral post read. My cat always meows differently before a pipe bursts. Always thought it was coincidence until now. Maybe we're the ones who need to learn how to listen. Local news stations that had initially painted Claire as unstable or attention-seeking now scrambled to correct their narrative. The same reporters who had done dramatic stand-ups about zoo security breaches were now doing in-depth pieces about animal intelligence and the need to reevaluate our understanding of other species. We owe Claire Bennett an apology, one prominent news anchor admitted on air. We were so quick to assume the worst, to fit the story into our preconceptions about what makes sense, that we missed the real story, one of dedication, scientific breakthrough, and genuine courage. The zoo's visitor numbers skyrocketed. People came from all over the country, hoping to see Kong and maybe witness some of the behaviors Claire had documented. Children pressed their faces against the glass, watching intently as the gorilla went about his daily routines. "Mommy, what's he trying to say?" became a common question, making parents and zoo staff smile. The scientific community's response was equally dramatic. Universities and research institutions that had previously dismissed Claire's work now reached out, eager to collaborate. Primatologists worldwide began reviewing their own observation data, looking for patterns they might have missed. Dr. Sarah Hendricks, a leading animal behaviorist from Stanford, published a statement that captured the mood of many researchers. Claire Bennett's work forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that our assumptions about animal intelligence might say more about our limitations than theirs. The zoo's gift shop couldn't keep up with demand for gorilla-related merchandise, but not the usual cute stuffed animals. People wanted books about gorilla behavior, field guides to primate communication, anything that might help them understand what Claire had discovered. Parents started bringing their children's drawings to the zoo, pictures of Kong with speech bubbles, trying to imagine what he might be saying. The zoo created a special bulletin board to display them, and it quickly became covered with hundreds of colorful interpretations of gorilla-human communication. Environmental groups seized the moment to advocate for better protection of great apes and their habitats. If gorillas can understand things about their environment that we miss, one activist pointed out, imagine what we're losing when we destroy their natural homes. Claire's story resonated particularly strongly with women in science. Online forums filled with discussions about the challenges of being taken seriously in male-dominated fields, of having unconventional research dismissed without proper evaluation. How many other Claire Bennetts are out there? A female graduate student wrote in a widely shared blog post. How many discoveries are we missing because we're too quick to dismiss someone who doesn't fit our idea of what a scientist should be or how research should be conducted? The zoo's board, initially defensive about their handling of Claire's research, made a public commitment to establishing a new research center focused on animal communication. They named it the Bennett Institute for Interspecies Communication Studies, a gesture that brought tears to Claire's eyes when she heard about it. It was never about being right, she said in her first public statement after the incident. It was about being willing to listen, really listen, to what these incredible animals are trying to tell us. Local schools began incorporating the story into their science curriculum. Teachers used it to discuss not just animal behavior, but the scientific method, the importance of observation, and the courage to stand up for your research even when others doubt you. Even skeptics found themselves reconsidering their positions. Dr. James Wilson, who had initially dismissed Claire's theories, wrote a thoughtful piece for a scientific journal. The history of science is full of moments when we had to admit that our understanding was more limited than we thought. This may be one of those moments. The public's fascination with Kong took on a different character. Instead of seeing him as just an impressive animal on display, visitors watched him with new eyes, trying to understand his gestures, his movements, his ways of interacting with his environment. He's not just sitting there, a young visitor observed. He's telling us something. We just have to learn how to understand. The story spread beyond the scientific community and animal lovers. Business schools used it as a case study in innovation and thinking outside the box. Leadership seminars talked about the courage to stand up for your convictions. Psychology classes discussed it in terms of how humans perceive and interact with other species. Claire herself remained humble about the attention. When finally convinced to give a TED Talk about her experience, she spent most of it talking about Kong and the other gorillas, about their intelligence and their capacity for communication. The real heroes of this story are the animals themselves, she said. They've been trying to communicate with us all along. I just happened to be the one who is finally ready to listen. The public reaction to Claire's story marked a shift in how people viewed not just gorillas, but all animals. It sparked a wider conversation about intelligence, communication, and the need to expand our understanding of the creatures we share our world with. As one child's letter to the zoo put it, with the simple wisdom of youth, maybe Kong isn't the one who needs to learn new tricks. Maybe we are. The transformation of Lincoln City Zoo in the months following Claire's incident was comprehensive and far-reaching. What began as a security crisis evolved into a complete rethinking of how the zoo operated, particularly in terms of animal observation and safety protocols. The first major change came in the form of a new monitoring system. Inspired by Claire's research, the zoo installed advanced sensors throughout the gorilla enclosure to detect the environmental changes Kong had been reacting to: subtle vibrations, changes in air pressure, variations in temperature and humidity. We're basically creating a technological version of what Kong already knows, Dr. Martinez explained during a staff training session. But instead of dismissing his behaviors as random, we're now using them as an additional early warning system. The security team underwent a complete reorganization. Instead of focusing solely on preventing break-ins, they were now trained to watch for and document unusual animal behaviors. Each security guard carried a tablet with access to a new app developed specifically for behavioral monitoring. See something, log something became the new mantra. Even the simplest observation might be important. Jeff Morgan, the guard who had found Claire that morning, was promoted to head a new department focusing on nighttime animal behavior observation. It's not just about watching the enclosures anymore, Jeff told his team. It's about watching the animals themselves, understanding what they're trying to tell us. The zoo's maintenance schedules were completely revamped. Regular structural inspections now included input from animal behavior specialists. If an animal showed unusual behavior around specific areas, those zones got priority inspection. We learned the hard way that animals often sense problems before our instruments can detect them, Sarah Chin admitted during a board meeting. Now we're making that knowledge an official part of our safety protocols. Staff training underwent a major overhaul as well. Every employee, from zookeepers to gift shop workers, received basic training in animal behavior observation. The zoo created a special communication channel where any staff member could report unusual animal behavior without fear of being dismissed or ridiculed. The cleaner mopping the floors might notice something the experts miss, Sarah explained. We can't afford to ignore any observation, no matter who it comes from. The zoo's research protocols were completely restructured. Where once there had been rigid hierarchies and strict limitations on research methodologies, there was now more flexibility for unconventional approaches. A new peer review system was established that included experts in animal behavior from outside the traditional zoological community. Perhaps the most significant change was the establishment of the Emergency Response Protocol, nicknamed the Bennett Protocol by staff. If any animal showed consistent, unusual behavior, especially around structural elements or mechanical systems, it triggered an automatic review process. No more waiting for traditional signs of problems, Dr. Martinez explained. If an animal is trying to tell us something, we listen first and ask questions later. The zoo's educational programs were completely redesigned to incorporate these new understandings. Visitors now learn not just about animal species and habitats, but about animal intelligence and communication. Children were encouraged to observe and record animal behaviors during their visits. We're raising a new generation of observers, the education director said. Kids naturally want to understand what animals are trying to say. We're just giving them the tools to do it systematically. The physical infrastructure of the zoo underwent significant changes too. New observation points were created that allowed both researchers and visitors to watch animals from angles that made their behavioral signals more visible. The gorilla enclosure, in particular, was modified to include better lighting and clearer sightlines. We're not just showing animals anymore, Sarah explained to a group of visiting zoo directors. We're creating spaces where we can learn from them. Emergency protocols were updated to include animal behavior in risk assessment. If multiple animals showed unusual behavior patterns, it could now trigger everything from focused inspections to full facility evacuations. Better safe than sorry became the new approach. If Kong and his family are trying to tell us something, we pay attention. The zoo's veterinary practices evolved as well. Animals' behavioral changes were now logged as potential health indicators, not just physical symptoms. The veterinary team worked closely with behaviorists to develop new diagnostic approaches that combined traditional medical examination with behavioral observation. Sometimes they know something's wrong before we can detect it with our instruments, the head veterinarian admitted. We're learning to trust their instincts alongside our technology. Claire's research became required reading for all new staff members. Her observation methods, once dismissed as unscientific, were now taught as fundamental techniques. The zoo even created a special fellowship program, bringing in researchers interested in studying animal communication and intelligence. The impact of these changes reached far beyond Lincoln City Zoo. Other zoos and wildlife facilities began adopting similar protocols, creating a network of institutions sharing behavioral observation data. What had started as one woman's desperate attempt to prevent an accident had evolved into a new standard for animal care and safety. The lessons we learned from Claire and Kong changed everything, Sarah reflected, watching visitors interact with the gorillas in new, more mindful ways. We thought we were the teachers, but it turns out we had a lot to learn. The zoo's new motto, displayed prominently at the entrance, summed up the transformation: watching, learning, understanding. Below it, in smaller letters, was a quote from Claire. Every animal has a voice. Our job is to learn how to listen. As the sun set over the zoo each evening, Kong would still make his rounds, checking his territory, communicating in his own way. But now, thanks to Claire's courage and the lessons learned from her actions, he had an audience that was finally ready to understand what he was trying to say.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.